The next morning was fine. Simon and Jessica were feeling very excited. Tim talked about the hidden people and about going to see a witch as if it was the most ordinary thing in the world. But it made Jessica feel just a bit scared and excited at the same time. She knew Simon was feeling the same way because he hugged himself from time to time. They put some apples in their pockets and slipped out just before 11 o'clock. Auntie Lizzie had gone off to the shop early as usual and Uncle Joe was sleeping. Tim must have been watching for them because he came out as soon as they got to the tree. "Where's Sebastian?" asked Jessica. "He went out early this morning and hasn't come back," said Tim. "I expect he's doing something for Melinda. We may see him later." "It's a good thing the sun's out. The hidden people don't often come out in the sunshine." "Tell us about the hidden people," said Simon. "Well, there's Melinda," said Tim, as they started out of the yard. "Melinda's a safe witch, as I told you, and she lives in a little stone cottage out past Hollow Hill down by the canal. Then there's Captain Jory, he lives in Hollow Hill. Did you see that black barge on the canal yesterday? I expect they're running a cargo. They take things down to Hollow Hill in that barge at night." "Who are they?" asked Simon. "They're smugglers," said Tim. "One of them's called Jack, and then there's Tobias." "Who's Tobias?" asked Simon. "Oh, Tobias is a cat," said Tim. "I think he was once a witch's cat, but I don't know. He's one of the hidden people. He's black and he's got very green eyes." "So is Sebastian," said Jessica. "Sebastian is Tobias' son," said Tim. "His mother was an ordinary cat, but Tobias is his father, so he's one of the strange ones. Now, the strange ones are ordinary people like us, as far as you can see, but they're a cross between ordinary folk and hidden people. They can work all kinds of magic. You'll see." Jessica danced along with excitement. "Are there any more of them about here?" asked Simon. "Not here," said Tim, "at least not as far as I know. I met some up north. Sebastian is the only strange one I know down here, but you can never be sure. Strange ones look just like ordinary people, so you have to be careful." They went along the canal without speaking for a time. Jessica and Simon were thinking about what Tim had said. They came to a yard where lorries were parked. There was a fence around the yard, but the gate was open. Tim looked round carefully. Then he went in, and the other two followed. They crossed the yard and came to another gate out onto a lane. It seemed a very long time before at last they left the houses and factories behind them and came to green fields. They found an old log lying beside the path. They sat down on it for a few minutes while they ate their apples. Tim had some sandwiches with him, and they all shared them. "The sun's gone in," said Simon as they set out along a path that ran by the canal. "It's cold." There were fields on both sides of them now, and they could see the hills. Tim looked up at the sky. Great black clouds were blowing in from the west. "I don't like it," he said. "It's turned into that sort of day when hidden people are about. Keep a sharp lookout as we go along, and tell me if you see anyone at all." "Look, there's someone over there by that wood now," said Simon. "Look." He pointed to a little wood on the far side of the canal. A dark figure in a long skirt was standing under the trees. "Don't let her know you've seen her," said Tim quickly. "I've never seen her before, but I'm sure she's one of them." "Let's run for a bit," said Simon. "I'm cold." "We'd better not run," said Tim. "We can keep a better watch if we're walking, and I don't want them to know we've seen them. I thought the people in Hollow Hill were friendly, but now I'm not so sure." They went on. Simon was right, it was much colder now that the sun had gone. They walked quickly, looking right to left. Suddenly Tim stopped. "There's someone ahead," he said. "There's someone sitting by the lock gates." There were some thick bushes by the lock gates across the canal, and they could just see a dark shape behind one of them. As they watched, the shape stood up. It was a man in a long blue coat with brass buttons. He had a black patch over one eye. He only had one arm, but a sword hung at his side. "Captain Jory!" cried Tim, running forward. "It's all right, it's Captain Jory." "Yes, it's Captain Jory," said the man as the three of them came running up. "But it isn't all right, Tim. I've been waiting here to warn you. You can't get through to Melinda's house this way. You'll have to go by the road." "But why?" asked Simon. "Because there are people on the path who will stop you," said Captain Jory. "Tim knows. You can't pass Hollow Hill by this path, Tim." "But you're living in Hollow Hill," said Tim. Captain Jory shook his head. Hollow Hill has been taken over by witches, he said. We're living under the mound in Piper's Wood. Melinda will tell you. You go and see Melinda, only go by the road, not by the path along here. There was a strange whistling cry high up in the air. Listen to that, will you? Cried Captain Jory. I'm off. You get up to the road. Keep clear of Hollow Hill. Keep clear of the river path. He turned into some bushes at the side of the path and disappeared. They stared up into the dark sky, and as they looked, a shape was blown across from one cloud to another very high up. It might have just been another cloud, but it looked like 3 old women in tall pointed hats with long dark cloaks blowing out behind them. Witches, said Tim. Come on, we'll go across the fields. The road's just over there. Look, this way, quickly. What was that whistle? Asked Simon. It's the witches, said Tim. I've heard of them before. Come on, run. They climbed over a gate and ran across the grass. They came to another gate, climbed it, and came out onto a road. They looked back. There was no sign of the witches or of anyone else in the fields or in the sky. They set off down the road, walking as fast as they could. There were no cars. Nobody seemed to be about at all. Look over there, said Tim suddenly when they came to another gate, and he pointed back towards the canal. They looked across the field. On the far side of the canal they could see a hill. There was a ring of trees on top of the hill. Someone had lit a big bonfire in the middle of a ring. That's Hollow Hill, said Tim, and that fire must mean that the witches are up there. Come on, it's not far to Melinda's now. They hurried on down the road until they came to a turning. A path ran down to a bridge over the canal. There was a little stone house at the side of the path. That's Melinda's house, said Tim. We're all right now. Jessica could hear the relief in his voice. They ran down the path towards the house. There was a little purr, and Sebastian jumped onto Tim's shoulder. Hello, Sebastian, said Tim, stopping for a moment. Were you out looking for us? Sebastian purred and rubbed his head against Tim's ear. Simon opened the gate into the little garden, and they went across to the door of a house. Jessica stared at the brass knocker on the door. It was the face of an old man with pointed ears and a pointed beard. Jessica couldn't help thinking that it looked exactly like the old man she met in the yard. He had been called Knocker too. She wondered if Tim would use it, but at that moment the door opened and an old woman stood in the doorway. She had long white hair and dark black eyes, and she was wearing a red shawl. She smiled as she saw Tim. Tim, she said, come in, I've been waiting for you, and Jessica and Simon too. Come in, all of you, out of the cold, it's no day to be outside. Simon kept close to Jessica. He was feeling very excited, but just a little bit frightened too, and he didn't want to show it. Jessica was feeling scared. After all, Melinda was a witch. Tim had said that she was a safe witch, but Jessica wondered just what that meant. Then Melinda looked at her and smiled, and Jessica suddenly felt much better. Come and sit by the fire, said Melinda. Don't be afraid. Nothing will hurt you here. There was a tiger skin rug on the floor in front of the fire. The head of a tiger was facing them, and it looked very fierce. It almost looked as if it was alive. Jessica noticed that Tim was careful not to tread on the rug, and she kept away from it too. So did Simon. There were 3 stools by the fire, and they sat down on them. Sebastian jumped onto Tim's knee, and Melinda sat down in an old wooden chair. Well, Tim, she said, did you see Captain Jory? Tim nodded. He told us there were witches in Hollow Hill, he said. So there are, said Melinda, and that's why I sent for you. The wild witches came down from the north 10 days ago and drove out the hidden people who were living there. But they couldn't, said Tim. The wild witches can't cross running water. Only the wind witches can do that. The wild witches can do it too, Tim, said Melinda grimly. It's taken me 7 days to find out how they can do it, but now I know. The wild witches have found a talisman. What's a talisman? Asked Simon. He was sitting forward on his stool, his eyes wide open, listening to every word. Melinda looked at him. A talisman is something that has magic powers, Simon, she said. This talisman is a little golden flute. It was kept in the dark caves of St Ninian's Island far up in the north. One of the hidden people stole it and gave it to the wild witches. If they have the talisman, they can cross running water. They can go where they please. Jessica could tell from Melinda's voice this was a terrible thing to happen. There was silence for a moment. Jessica shivered. "What happened at Hollow Hill?" Tim asked at last. "The witches swept down in all their power," said Melinda. "I looked into the magic glass and saw them coming. I sent Sebastian to warn the hidden people, and he was just in time. They fled to the mound in Piper's Wood. The wild witches have taken Hollow Hill, and while they're there, no one is safe." Jessica saw Tim glance quickly at Melinda. She remembered what he had said. "I always go if Melinda wants me. She doesn't send for me unless she needs me." Surely Melinda wouldn't expect him to help her drive away wild witches. But after a moment, Tim said quietly, "What do you want me to do?" Melinda smiled. When she smiled, her whole face changed. Even her dark eyes seemed to smile. "I do want you to help me, Tim," she said. "You're quite right. Someone must go into Hollow Hill and bring the talisman back here to me." "But how can I do that with wild witches in Hollow Hill?" said Tim anxiously. "No one could get near the hill while they're there." Melinda shook her head. "You're wrong there, Tim," she said. "There's a way into Hollow Hill. There's a secret tunnel that runs underground from a mound in Piper's Wood. It's closed to the witches by magic. They cannot use it, even if they have a talisman. It's closed to the hidden people too. The magic is so strong that none of us can go that way. But one of the ordinary folk could go, or one of the strange ones." Tim stared at her. Jessica saw that his face had gone pale, but after a moment or two he said, "When do you want me to go?" "I want your help, Tim," said Melinda, "but you can't get the talisman for me. Only Jessica can do that." Jessica felt as if she'd been hit by a very big wave. She stared at Melinda so surprised that she could scarcely breathe. Melinda turned to look at her. "No man or boy must touch this talisman," she said. "If he does, he will forget everything he has ever known. He will forget what he is trying to do. He will even forget who he is. This is a talisman that only a woman or a girl can take unhurt. That is part of the magic. Tim can help you, Jessica, but so can Simon. But they mustn't touch the talisman. I will help you, and so will Sebastian, but you will have to be the one to go into Hollow Hill and bring the talisman out to me." "Why can't you go?" asked Simon. "You're a woman, you could get it." He spoke angrily, and Jessica expected Melinda to be angry too, but she wasn't. "Even I cannot go through the secret tunnel into Hollow Hill, Simon," she said quietly, "and my magic is not strong enough to drive out the wild witches unless I have the talisman. Once I have that, I can change the witches into mist, and they'll be blown away on the wind." "But Jessica can't go alone," said Tim. "You can go with her through the secret tunnel," said Melinda. "You can go as far as Hollow Hill, but only Jessica can go safely into Hollow Hill itself while the talisman is there." Jessica's mouth felt dry, her hands were shaking. "But I can't," she said. "I can't go alone into Hollow Hill with wild witches there, not by myself." "I can give you a drink which will make you invisible," said Melinda. "No one will be able to see you, not even Tim. For wild witches will know that someone strange is in Hollow Hill, and they'll be able to hear you. They won't be able to see you, though." Jessica shook her head. She was very near to tears. She had thought something exciting was going to happen, but this was terrible. "I can't," she said. I just can't." Melinda put out a hand and touched Jessica on the shoulder. "Very well, child," she said quietly. "I expect you're right. It was too much to ask of anyone. I will try and think of some other way to drive wild witches out." "It's not fair to ask Jessica to go alone," said Simon fiercely. "It would be all right if we could all go." "But you can't," said Melinda. "And perhaps you're right, Simon. Perhaps it's not fair to ask Jessica to go alone." She looked out of the window. "It's getting dark early today," she said. "I think there will be a storm. You must be going home. And I will think what we can do and then send Locker to you again, but be careful, don't go out after dark. Remember, the wild witches may come into the town. They were hidden people in the yard last night, said Tim. Aaron and I saw them under the tree. That means the wild witches or their friends are already in the town, said Melinda. You must be very careful. We shan't be home before dark tonight, said Tim, looking out the window. We'll have to go by the road, and it's a long way. Melinda shook her head. Sebastian and Tobias will take you back tonight, Tim, she said. The road isn't safe after dark. Come. She went to the door and opened it. A black cat with very green eyes and a long pointed tail walked in. Tobias! Cried Tim. Hello, Tim, said the cat. I've got 2 broomsticks outside. The witches are all inside Hollow Hill for the moment, and Sebastian and I will be taking you back. Goodbye, Jessica, said Melinda. You and Simon will be safe with Sebastian. Tobias will take Tim. Don't be unhappy, child. I was asking too much. Jessica choked. I'm sorry, she whispered. Melinda patted her shoulder in a comforting way. They went outside. Sebastian was waiting for them. He ran to Tim and rubbed himself against Tim's legs. 2 broomsticks were lying on the path outside the door. They were garden broomsticks, and each had a bundle of twigs on one end. Tobias walked across to one of them, and Sebastian went to the other. Both cats waved their tails. The broomsticks lifted off the ground and hung in the air just above the path. Each cat jumped onto one end of the broomstick. Jessica and Simon stood still, staring, but Tim went to Tobias's broomstick and sat on it naturally, as if he were getting into a car. Sit on the broomstick like Tim, said Melinda. Hold tight. Sebastian will fly you home. Simon ran to the broomstick and sat on it just behind Sebastian. Jessica went more slowly. She sat down and gripped the wood with her hands. Goodbye, said Melinda again, and don't be unhappy. I will think of some other way. Tobias twitched his tail, and the broomstick shot up into the air. Sebastian followed. The broomstick jerked upwards, and Simon and Jessica found themselves flying high up over the trees and fields, looking down at the road below them. Simon laughed excitedly. Jessica knew how he felt. It was an exciting feeling to be flying through the air. But she felt so unhappy that she wished she was back at home. Tobias had said the wild witches were all inside Hollow Hill. She hoped he was right. Sebastian suddenly checked the broomstick and swooped down towards the ground. They hovered in the air for a moment just above the trees. Then the broomstick jerked so suddenly that Simon and Jessica nearly fell off, and they shot up into the air again after Tobias. The broomstick swung to the left, leaving the road on the right. They were flying very fast. The wind whistled through their hair. Soon they saw houses below them and the lights of cars driving along the road. Then they saw the streets of the town. They could see all the people hurrying home. Soon they were flying over the canal again. The broomstick swung down through the gap in the houses into the yard and came to a stop under the old tree. They hovered just above the ground. Tim, Jessica and Simon got off. Sebastian's broomstick fell to the ground. Sebastian ran to Jessica and rubbed himself against her leg. Then he ran across to Tim and jumped onto Tim's shoulder. Tobias remained standing on his broomstick. Jessica saw his eyes flash green. Goodbye, Tim, he said. Goodbye, Simon. He didn't even look at Jessica. The broomstick shot up into the dark sky. They saw Tobias sail over the roofs of the house and away into the night. Sorry, Tim, said Jessica. Don't you worry, said Tim. Melinda will think of something. She didn't take the coins back, did she? That means you'll see her again. But she won't ask you to go into Hollow Hill. And don't worry about Tobias. He's a strange cat, but he's all right. At least I think he is. The door of the house opened and Uncle Joe looked out. Hey, you two, he called. Been looking for you. Come on in. Tea's ready and your aunt's back. She doesn't like you staying out when it's dark. It's only just dark, said Simon. It's too dark for you to be out, said Uncle Joe. Now, come on in and have tea. See you tomorrow, said Tim. Simon and Jessica ran off into the house, and Tim turned away with Sebastian still on his shoulder. Jessica didn't cry until she got into bed. But then, when she was on her own and there was no one to see her, she wept. She couldn't help it. She had been so glad to go to Melinda's house with Tim. Flying on a broomstick was the most exciting thing she'd ever done. But she couldn't face going alone into Hollow Hill to look for the talisman, not with the wild witches there. Melinda had said that the witches wouldn't be able to see her, but how could she be sure of that? And even if they couldn't see her, they would know she was there. It would be like a horrible game of blind man's buff. But she so wanted to be with Tim and the hidden people, and it had been the most exciting day she had ever had, and now she had spoilt it. She sobbed into her pillow. She felt lost and lonely and miserable. There was a tap outside the window. Jessica sat up. There was something outside. She slipped over to the window and looked out. Sebastian was standing on the end of the broomstick, floating in the air by the windowsill. Jessica pushed up the window and he jumped inside. "Sebastian!" cried Jessica. "I'm so glad to see you." Sebastian rubbed himself around her legs and purred. She picked him up and climbed back onto the bed, but he wouldn't settle down. He climbed up onto the pillow beside her, still purring, and rubbed his head under her chin. Then he jumped down onto the floor again, ran across to the window and jumped out. Jessica leapt out of bed. She was just in time to see Sebastian disappearing over the roofs of the houses opposite, riding his broomstick. His head was up and his tail was waving wildly in the wind. Jessica shivered. It was very cold and the sky was dark with clouds. She shut the window and went slowly back to bed. She climbed in and pulled the bedclothes up around her shoulders. She was feeling much better. Tobias had gone off without speaking to her, but Sebastian had come to see her. She was sure that he was telling her they were still friends. She heard a burst of rain against the window and hoped that Sebastian hadn't far to go. She snuggled down into the bedclothes and went to sleep. The next day was wet and grey and miserable. Jessica hoped they would see Tim, but they didn't. Uncle Joe and Auntie Lizzie went out to see some friends and took Jessica and Simon with them. No one was unkind to the children, but they couldn't help feeling in the way. There was nothing much for them to do, and they were glad to get home. They saw no sign of Tim or Sebastian when they got back, and they felt tired and dull. They went upstairs early and they both fell asleep as soon as they got into bed. Monday was a grey day, but the rain had stopped. Jessica and Simon went into the town. Auntie Lizzie had given them a shopping list of some plastic bags and asked them to get all kinds of things for the house, and Uncle Joe had given them enough money for them to buy something to eat. They were sitting in a cafe eating fish and chips when the door opened and a strange old woman came in. She was wearing a long dark red skirt and she had a green shawl over her head. Her eyes were as black as Melinda's, but they weren't as friendly. She sat down near Simon and Jessica and stared at them. "You see her?" Simon whispered. Jessica nodded. "Don't let her see you watching," she whispered back. They drank their tea slowly. No one else in the cafe took any notice of the old woman in the green shawl. A man came in and sat down at the table where she was sitting. Jessica suddenly realised that he couldn't see the old woman. "Simon," she whispered urgently. "Look, the man, he can't see her." The waitress went over to the man and he ordered some meat pies. She took no notice of the old woman. "She must be one of the hidden people," whispered Jessica. "But she doesn't look very friendly." "Perhaps she's one of the witches," said Simon. "Let's go, Simon," said Jessica. "Let's go now." They paid for their lunch and left the cafe. Jessica looked back as they walked off down the street. The old woman had come out of a cafe. She was following them. "Quick," cried Jessica, "we've got to get away." They tried to run, but the streets were so crowded they found themselves bumping into people. They turned into the high street. "Look," said Simon, "there's Marks and Spencer's. We'll lose her in there." They ran across the street and plunged into the crowd inside the shop. One or two people looked rather cross as they pushed their way through. "Such madness," they heard one woman say. "I can't think what's got into children these days." "Is there a back entrance?" said Jessica breathlessly. "Down there," said Simon. "Look, there's a red arrow and a sign saying way out. Come on." They struggled through the crowd to the way out sign. There was a door near to it into another street. They slipped out of the door and into the crowd outside. They looked up and down the street, but there was no sign of the old woman. "Are you sure we should run away?" asked Simon. "She might have come from Melinda." "She didn't come from Melinda," said Jessica. "I'm sure she didn't. You could tell by the way she looked at us. Melinda would have sent Knocker or Sebastian." They finished the rest of the shopping, keeping a careful watch behind them, but they didn't see the old woman again. They got back just before tea. Jessica wondered if she should go and catch Tim on his way back from school and tell him about the old woman, but she didn't like to. Tim had been kind, but she was afraid he wouldn't want to see her because she wouldn't go into Hollow Hill. He always helped Melinda himself. He'd said so. Jessica stood at her bedroom window looking out into the yard and wondering what to do next. She needn't have worried. She saw Tim come through the gap and run across to his own house. A few minutes later, he came out again. He crossed the yard, ran up their steps 2 at a time, and knocked on the front door. Jessica ran down and opened it. Tim was looking rather worried. "Hello, Jess," he said. "Have you seen Sebastian?" "Not today," said Jessica. "He came to see me on Saturday night. He flew a broomstick up to my window, but I haven't seen him since." "I hope he's okay," Tim said. "He went out on Saturday night after we got back. That must have been when he came to see you, but he didn't come back in the morning. He wasn't there all day yesterday or last night." "He flew over the rooftops after he left me," said Jessica. "I expect he's off doing something for Melinda," said Tim, "but he's not often away so long." "I haven't seen Sebastian, but we did see a strange old woman in the town," said Jessica. "I think she was one of the hidden people, but she wasn't friendly." "Perhaps she was one of the witch's friends," said Tim. "I do wish Sebastian would come back." "You don't think anything could have happened to him?" asked Jessica. Tim shook his head. "I expect he's all right," he said. "Sebastian could take care of himself, but I don't like it when he's away for such a long time, and especially just now with wild witches in Hollow Hill. Come and tell me if you do see him." "Yeah, I will do," said Jessica. Tim ran off down the steps and back across the yard to his own house. Jessica felt a little better. Tim had been just as friendly as before. Then she thought of Sebastian. She hoped he was all right. He was such a friendly little cat, and he seemed willing to do anything Melinda said. So perhaps he was with Melinda.